Hello YouTube, this is Mario here with another edition of Off the Walls Magic. So today is kind of a fun little deck tech video. This is probably the last video I'm going to do for a while as I head into my final year of grad school. I won't really have a whole lot of time to make any videos, but I figured go out with a bang, do a fun one. This is a deck that I have been working on pretty much since the namesake card of this deck was spoiled, but up until the release of Modern Horizons, we just didn't really have the tools to make it work as effectively as I believe it does now. This is a modern Hedron alignment deck. So Hedron alignment, you require 4 copies in the deck. And so how this works, you have a 3-mana enchantment. The enchantment has hexproof. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may reveal your hand. If you do, you win the game if you own a card named Hedron Alignment in exile, in your hand, in your graveyard, and on the battlefield. Then it has the additional ability there that you can pay 1 and a blue to scry 1. So this is a very difficult win condition to pull off. And even with the tools that we have at our disposal now, the odds of winning with this deck are probably slim to none. But if you do get the win, then by all means, bragging rights to the fullest extent. Now, the reason this is so hard to pull off is that you need it in 4 zones. So you have to resolve 1, you have to exile 1, you have to mill 1, and you have to have 1 in your hand. So it's a lot of setup. But if you pull it off, it's honestly the best feeling in Magic. I have won some games with Hedron Alignment back when it was in Standard, but the deck was incredibly janky and nowhere near as effective as it is now. So why I say I feel like the tools needed to pull this off, we just got them in Modern Horizons. There are actually a few cards that we've kind of been missing to kind of make this plan work. Primarily is a land card called Hall of Heliod's Generosity. This is essentially an Academy Ruins, I believe the card is, but for enchantment. So it taps for colorless. You could pay a generic and a white. You can tap this to put an enchantment card from a graveyard on top of your library. Now, the reason why Hedron Alignment has been so difficult to actually pull off is a lot of the times you either unintentionally put 1 too many Hedrons in the grave, or maybe you exile 1 too many. But I feel like this Hall of Heliod's Generosity has actually made it so the overmilling isn't so much of a problem. And a lot of the times, while people tend to have the issue of not getting 1 into exile or 2 of them getting exiled, more often than not, it's the problem of actually getting the first one in exile. And so we have a wide variety of cards at our disposal now that actually help us do just that. The other key piece that we got with Modern Horizons is 3 copies of Force of Negation. And the Hall of Heliod's Generosity, we're just running 1 because it's a legendary land. But the Force of Negation, just being able to, at the end of your opponent's first turn even, or even later in the game, exile Hedron Alignment from hand to counter and exile a non-creature spell. So if your opponent's like, oh, Jace the Mind Sculptor, or if they're like turn 1 Thoughtseize and you have a Hedron Alignment in hand, just pitch the Hedron Alignment, counter that Thoughtseize, keep all the information in your hand secret, and they'll be none the wiser. And they'll definitely be caught off guard by this. Other options that we have available for exiling Hedron Alignment, this deck is mainboarding 4 copies of Serum Powder. So Serum Powder, if it's in your opening hand, you can exile all the cards from your hand, then draw that many cards. So if Hedron Alignment is in your hand, you can exile, before the game even starts, you can exile a Hedron and all the other cards in your hand, draw 7 cards. So before the game even starts, you've got the most difficult Hedron in position. Next, for the exiling plan is Logic Knot. So Logic Knot, blue X, you can delve, so exile cards from your graveyard, and each card that you exile from your graveyard pays for basically 1 out of the X cost. So if you have a Hedron in your graveyard, you could pay 2 blue, exile a Hedron, or any other cards that you need to exile and just counter whatever their spell is. So we now have at our disposal the Force of Negations, Serum Powders, Logic Knots, as very proactive ways to both thin out your deck, exile a Hedron, and keep your opponent off of their game plan. Now the other issue with getting Hedrons in exile that people tend to have is when they've got too many Hedrons in exile. And that's where this next card comes into play. This is a 1-mana instant called Pull from Eternity. Sorry, that's one of my residents. Pull from Eternity, single white mana, instant speed. You may put target face-up card that's removed from the game into its owner's graveyard. So if you over-exile Hedrons, you can put one of them from exile into your graveyard, putting it into position. Another fun little playline you could do, let's say you already have one Hedron in exile, thanks to like Serum Powder or something. All right. And then your opponent casts something very problematic. Let's say it's a Liliana of the Veil, or Thought Seizes, Jace the Mind Sculptors, you name it, non-creature spell, very, very problematic for you. You can actually knowledgeably exile a second copy of Hedron Alignment with Force of Negation, and then put it back into your yard with the Pull from Eternity. So basically, you're countering their spell, and then also moving one Hedron from exile in your grave. Or say that your opponent surgically extracts your Hedron alignments. We have 3 copies of Pull from Eternity as well as other ways to recur it. So long as they don't surgically extract the Pull from Eternity or extirpate it, or get all the copies into the exile zone, we have multiple ways to either cast this several times or to pull this out of the graveyard several times to keep casting it, and then move, like one by one, move the extra Hedrons out of exile into the grave if it got surgically extracted. So then we need ways to not only draw cards, but also put cards from our graveyard, or from our hand into our graveyard, specifically to try and filter through our deck and put Hedrons into the grave if the previously mentioned way is not available. So for that, we are going to run 4 copies of Champion of Wits. Champion of Wits is a 3-drop creature from Hour of Devastation. So 2 and a blue gets you a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you may draw cards equal to its power. If you do, discard 2 cards. So on its face value, it enters, it's basically a Faithless Looting on a stick. However, it's got this other ability called Eternalize. For 5 generic and 2 blue, you can exile Champion of Wits from your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4. So at that point, for 7 mana, you can play this from the grave, get a 4/4, draw 4, then discard 2. So at that point, it's actually generating card advantage. You can only Eternalize it as a sorcery, however. Excuse me. But also because this is an activated ability, you're not casting the champion a second time. It also means your opponent cannot directly counter this unless they have something like Tail's End or Nimble Obstructionist, something that specifically counters a ability. Or if they exile this from your yard in response to paying the cost, obviously. But another way to get Graveyard Recursion, filter through your deck, put Hedrons where they need to go. Next we have 2 copies of Bizarre Trade Mage, and the Champion of Wits is a 4 of. 3 mana gets you a 3/4 with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you can draw 2, then discard 3. One sec. Alrighty, sorry about that delay. I am back. So after Bizarre Trade Mage, we're running a single copy of Search for Azcanta. 2 mana legendary enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can look at the top card. You may put that card into your graveyard. Then if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you may transform Search for Azcanta. So then when it transforms, it becomes a legendary land. You can tap it for a blue. You can pay 2 and a blue and tap it to look at the top 4 cards of your library, reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So in the late game, if the only Hedron that you have left to align is the one in your hand, what you could actually do, if, let's say you got a Hedron on the field, Hedron in grave, Hedron in exile, at that point your deck is probably super thin. So at the beginning of your upkeep, when the Hedron alignment ability goes on the stack, you can respond to that holding priority. dig with the Azcanta, hopefully find that 4th Hedron, then proceed with resolving Hedron alignment to win the game on the spot. So it filters your draws, controls your draws, puts cards into the yard, and later lets you dig for the Hedrons, or any of your counter magic removal or planeswalkers, whatever. The next card is 3 copies of Tamiyo, Collector of Tales. Personally, this card is why I'm going Bant. You could just go like blue-white or blue-white-black to have more access to like hand disruption or, you know, like Stitcher Supplier, things like that. But I played this in a Bant Reanimator deck, the one with the Alternatives of Dementia and all that jazz. And it was just an all-star in that deck. And so I figured I would try it out in this. You know, the static ability is sometimes relevant. But her 2 activated abilities are what really makes this card great for this deck. You know, +1, you can choose a non-land card name, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all cards with the chosen name from among them into your hand, the rest in your graveyard. So if you need to draw a Hedron alignment, you could +1 name Hedron alignment and hope that it's in the top 4. If you are looking for anything else and maybe you're trying to specifically get Hedrons into the grave, then you could +1 name literally anything else and put some Hedrons into the grave. Maybe you put too many. Well, then you got the Hall of Heliod's Generosity to put it back on top. You've got the Logic Knots to delve it away. Just a bunch of fun recursive things. And then additionally, -3, you get to return target card from your graveyard to your hand. So obviously, yeah, you can return Hedron from your grave to your hand, but you can also grab Hall of Heliod's Generosity if you mill it. You can return your Force of Negations, your Logic Knots, even your Pull from Eternity. This is the way that we can repeatedly recur this spell. And so, if the Hedrons get surgically extracted or something along those lines, you could cast this, put 1 from your exile into your graveyard, -3 this, get back, pull from Eternity, recast it, put another 1 into your yard. This is kind of like I don't want to say the glue that holds the whole deck together, but it is a very important card that, honestly, I don't think there is a replacement for in this deck. So, after all of our combo potential and all that, the rest is pretty simple. We're running 4 copies of Serum Visions, 1 mana, draw a card, scry 2, helps you set up your next draws, helps you dig for what you need. 2 copies of Path to Exile, just for some pretty basic removal. Exile a creature, yeah, they get a land, but, you know, we don't have that many creatures, so just getting rid of one of theirs is perfectly fine. We're trying to basically stall out or tempo them out so that we can, you know, align our Hedrons. Then next we have 4 copies of Remand, 2 mana, counter a spell, back to their hand, draw a card, and then to the mana base. So in addition to the Hall of Heliod's Generosity, we're also running 1 copy of Gyre Reach Sanitarium. So it does tap for a generic. You can pay 2 and tap it. Each player draws a card, then discards a card. Maybe you have a Hedron in your hand you're trying to get rid of. Just activate this, draw a new card, pitch the Hedron. And then if you overpitch Hedrons, you know, the Hall grabs 1 back. For the rest of the mana base, running 4 copies of Flooded Strand, 4 copies of Windswept Heath, 1 Temple Garden, 1 Hallowed Fountain, 2 Breeding Pools, 2 Waterlogged Groves, again, key card. Let's say you've scryed a Hedron to the top of your deck and you need to draw it before, you know, you resolve your Hedron's ability. You could just crack this to draw that Hedron, or, you know, maybe you just need any extra card in your hand. You just pay 1, crack it, draw a card. Then 3 islands, 2 plains, 2 forests. So that's the main deck. And then the sideboard, obviously sideboards always depend on your local meta. Personally, this is just what I like to play in my sideboard for this deck. But obviously, if your meta looks a lot different, then just sideboard is needed. What I'm running, 2 copies of Chalice of the Void, you know, XX artifacts, enters with X counters, and whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost equal to that, counter it. I don't bring this in too often. It's pretty much if I'm up against burn, then just dropping this with one counter is usually enough for me to hopefully get past them. One copy of Surgical Extraction, in case we run up against other decks like Arclight Phoenix decks, or maybe even they surgically extract our Hedron. Well, we can respond to that by surgically extracting the same one that they're targeting, so that they don't have a valid target. We keep one in our yard as needed, and all the rest in our deck hand, whatever. 2 copies of Pithing Needles, just to shut down like pesky planeswalkers. You know, that Karn, the Great Creator combo deck is still out and about, so just being able to shut down Karn so they can't tutor, or, you know, name Jace the Mind Sculptor, Teferi, you know, whatever, run in 6, doesn't matter. 2 copies of Davin's Veto, just a little extra counter magic if you're up against a control matchup. This is basically a negate that cannot be countered itself. 2 copies of Collector Oof. There you go. I said it. Don't hate me. I hated saying it, but whatever. Stoning Silence on a stick. Bring it in against Affinity. 2 Damping Spheres for Tron matchup. And then 4 copies of Leyline of Sanctity. Love that this is an M20. It's now an affordable card. Pick them up for a playset for 20 bucks. Is much better than 1 for 20 bucks. So yeah, if it's in your opening hand, you begin with it on the battlefield, and just you have hexproof, again, good against those burn decks. Otherwise, they don't really have a target for their spells unless you want to target themselves or their own creatures. So yeah, that is my Bant Hedron alignment deck. I hope you guys enjoy.